Does online church negatively impact in-person attendance?
That's the question we've all been asking for about 5 years now.
And finally, we've got some great data to help us get to the bottom of it.
We're joined again by Ryan Burge from Graphs About Religion to help us untangle it all.
Let's dive in. Well, hey there, and welcome to the Pro Church Tools Show. We're here to help you and your church navigate the biggest communication shift in 500 years. I'm Brady, your host. I'm joined as always by my co-host, it's Alexander Mills.
Hello, hello.
And we're also joined by the force of nature behind Graphs About Religion. Back again, it's Ryan Burge. Ryan, welcome back to the show.
I am a force of nature. That is exactly what I am.
It is accurate. We have been keeping track with your Substack. I am a subscriber myself, Graphs About Religion. Cannot speak highly enough about it. And I have basically taken stock of some of the most standout articles for me that I think our audience would benefit from and appreciate. And the biggest one that stood out to me over the last couple of months since we had you on the show was titled, Who is Attending Online Church? Where you basically summarized, hey, Pew asked 11,000 plus people in November of 2022, which was an important date because it was after, near the tail end of COVID, asked all those people a variety of questions about their worship attendance, both in person and virtual. And I was very surprised by some of the takeaways, because what pastors want to know is this: are there a bunch of people that are only watching online church and they're not coming in person? Yes or no?
No, that's actually probably the biggest takeaway is I hear when I go do church things, the people will ask me, that's one of the top 5 questions is, what do we do about online church? And for a long time, I just didn't have a good empirical answer to that question, because I know what happened is a lot of them weren't doing online church, then COVID happened, and then they started doing online church, and then they just kept doing online church because they saw people logging into the website and saw the clicks on YouTube and Facebook, and are like, well, I guess we'll keep doing it and then they're like, well, how do we build community in this online congregation? And I didn't really know what to tell them because I didn't know how big that number was. But the share of Americans who are honest to goodness, online only, they attend in person less than once a month, but attend nearly every week online, is about 5% of Americans, which is not nothing, of course. 5% of people is a lot of people in some ways, but it's not that many people in the grand scheme of all religion. So, and you also, the one thing I couldn't get into is what do you watch? I'm going to venture to guess that a lot of them watch a handful of different, religious, the big ones, like Steve Furtick at Elevation or Saddleback or something like that. How many people actually are committed to a small church with 75 people, 100 people, but only do it online? I don't think the answer is that many, generally speaking.
Well, that's something I'd be really interested to talk about a little bit later as we talk about the types of folks who are watching online church and what their participation in in-person church is. We're going to get into that in a moment, because I know my experience. I am a pastor of a local church, so I attend church weekly in person.
You're not part of the 5%.
No, but if I was part of the folks who completed this survey, I would have also checked I attend online church, because I consume a lot of online church stuff throughout the week, but it's not a church like mine. So we can talk about that in a moment. But Ryan, I just want you to say conclusively, there has not, or there has been an exodus from the church post-COVID. When we introduce all of these online services, folks have left the church to sit in their pajamas and eat popcorn and watch church online. They're contrary to our popular belief, you're saying there has not been an exodus that looks quite like that.
The problem is that church attendance has been declining for decades anyway. So if it declined between 2020 and 2023 by 2%, is that because of COVID, or was it just going to happen anyway because that's what's been going on for 35 years now? Everything I've looked at when it comes to COVID in the church tells me that it did not accelerate or decelerate the decline of religious attendance. We basically are today where we would have been if COVID would not have happened, or within a very tight tolerance of what 2024 would have looked like based on 2020 numbers. If you just shoot a straight line, like I did, I looked at the Episcopal Church because they can do all kinds of cool records like confirmations, baptisms, weddings, things like that. Their 2023 numbers looked exactly what I would have thought they would have looked like if you would have taken their prior 10-year numbers without COVID and projected it forward. So I think we're kind of exactly where we are. I don't think online church has killed in-person church, but I also don't think it's really meeting the needs of lots of new people either. That's actually probably one of the most interesting findings that needs to be thought about a lot more, is the idea that the people who are the most likely to watch church online are actually the people who are going to church in person the most. So weekly in-person church attenders are the most likely people to be watching church on, I call them heavy users of religion. You know, like they're there, they can't get enough of it, basically. So they go to their own church on Sunday or Saturday or Friday, and then they might watch one of these services on a Tuesday or a Wednesday or a Thursday, kind of supplement it. So I think we've got a segment who are very, very, very religiously engaged and can't get enough of it, and this is kind of feeding that need. And whether we could talk about whether that's a good thing or not, I don't really have a strong feeling either way, but I think it skews the numbers in some ways. Because, oh, look at all these people watching online, when maybe 75% of them were already going to church every week in person anyway. So you're not really adding to the fold. You're just giving these people more of what they want.
You mentioned that 5% number. 5% of people said, yeah, I'm watching church online. I'm not attending in person. I am not the numerologist. Is that a thing? What is your title, Ryan?
Statistician, I suppose.
There you go.
That was what I was going for.
Numerologist is like, oh, I saw 11:11 on the clock. What does that mean?
Okay, so I am not the statistician. So far away from the statistician, couldn't even think of the name, the title. Is 5% in a data set considered like, oh, that's notable? Or is that like, yeah, really small and probably not worth paying too much attention to?
That's the hard thing about numbers is everyone matters, but we only think about numbers in the aggregate. You know, like when I was in grad school, we read this book called Suicide by Emil Durkheim. It's the very first piece that was ever quantitative piece about religion, trying to figure out what caused people to commit suicide. And he actually went to morgues around Paris and got the death records. And they used to put things like religion on your death record. So he tried to figure out if religion makes you more or less likely to commit suicide. And he actually found, by the way, that Protestants commit suicide at higher rates than Catholics do, because Protestantism is a more individualized religion and Catholicism is more group religion, and social ties are what keeps you from, you know, killing yourself, at least in France in 1880, you know, so is that. But what's interesting is when we had that discussion in our grad class, one person goes, yeah, but doesn't this kind of like dehumanize people? You know, like we're talking about individuals who took their own life, and we're talking about them almost like in this crass, aggregate way. And my professor, Scott McCarty, who just passed away actually, said, he goes, do we care about why Bob killed himself? Yes, but we care a lot more about why people like Bob killed themselves. And so I think that helps us understand, like, both things matter, but as social scientists, we have to talk about things that top level stuff. And 5% of people is not nothing, but also it's like, I can't imagine trying to like gear your entire religious community towards an online space. It just doesn't seem like that's a need that's large enough. You know, talk about total addressable market when you go to like do venture capitalist stuff. How many people would buy your stuff? And the answer in this case is not too terribly many to want to like invest millions of dollars and hundreds of hours to try to like bolster your online web presence. I think is really not a tremendous use of your time.
Yeah, and you know what? That is reassuring, tracks with what we have said so many times on this show over the years. People asked us, hey, like, do you see a future for like online church as an exclusive, right? Like, I don't know, it seems kind of counterintuitive, backwards to what the church is best at. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the people that are both watching online and attending in person. And I would share your hypothesis, Ryan, that, hey, the people that are watching online and attending in person, they're probably supplementing their in-person with like other church services, most likely the more influential churches and pastors. Would you say that we can glean anything from this data in terms of preference? You talked about like this market and how much people care about this sort of thing. Do people like online church more than in person?
No, that's actually probably one of the findings that bubbles up the most is when you looked at people who did at least once a month for both. So, you know, they had experience in the online space and the face-to-face space. If you break it down by age, the people who are the most likely to like online are 18 to 29-year-olds, but only 1 in 5 of them said they preferred online, while 2/3 of them said they preferred in person. So even amongst the youngest Americans, 2/3 and 15% didn't have a preference. So 2/3 of them said they would rather go in person, and only 20% said they would rather go online. Amongst older people, it's at least 75% of them prefer in-person worship, and 10% prefer online worship. So you get this impression by looking at this data that very, very few people go, man, I could just go to church online the rest of my life, and that's fantastic. It feels like it's better than nothing, but certainly less than the ideal. Is the impression that you get from the data. There's actually a paper that was just published last year where they looked at psychological distress during the pandemic and in the year after the pandemic. And what they found was the only thing that reduced psychological distress was virtual attendance did nothing for psychological distress. The only thing that did was attending in person at least once a week. So there's no benefit, no psychological benefit to being an online attender. And there was a noticeable, statistically significant psychological benefit to being a face-to-face attender. So like, it's hard to look at all this data and say, yeah, online's fine. I mean, people don't seem to like it that much. It's not that large of a population, and it doesn't produce the same sort of empirical positive things in lives that we would want to see, both as a pastor and as a social scientist, by the way. Like, it's hard to look at this objectively and say, yeah, we should just replace lots of churches with virtual church. I just don't think that's not the way to go for the church. It's not the way to go for society. It's not the way to go for individuals either. This is not a good option. It's like candy. You know, it tastes good right now, but in the end of the day, it's not going to give you the nutrition you need. I think that's pretty clear coming from this data. That's what you're seeing.
For the folks who do attend online church, according to how your article kind of presents the data, something that your article does is dispel the myth that like, oh, it must be young folks or like digital natives, as we call them, who prefer to engage with church online. The data, as you present it, seem to say the opposite. It's that it skews towards older folks who are participating in church online more in contrast than younger folks. Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of gives us a little bit of an insight into as churches, church leaders, as pastors, if we are choosing to do online church, if we look at this data and see, okay, it's mostly older folks who are engaging with this, there are likely reasons, maybe mobility or sickness or whatever, but they still want to be connected to the church. Reverse engineering that should inform what we are doing online as a church. If we can see that, okay, most folks who are engaging with our church online are actually older and it's probably because of mobility or something like that, how can we cater this experience to them? Because looking at the data, it seems to be that's who is really needing this service from our church.
Yeah. About 70% of your virtual only attenders are 50 years and older, right? So they make up a vast oversample of your online church attenders. Educationally, it's people with a high school diploma or less make up a disproportionate amount. And what is even probably more interesting is African Americans are overrepresented in that virtual only crowd compared to other racial groups. So I don't know like what people conceive of in their minds and think of like they're virtual only people, but older, less educated, and then racial minorities are the ones who are consuming the most virtual only content. So, you know, one thing that we have to mention, though, like there's an ableist conversation that kind of weaves its way through this larger conversation about virtual church, people who just aren't physically able to get to church. I think that matters a lot, right? Like I think those people need to get something. And it's clear that this is an alternative. It's obviously not the ideal, and I don't think it should be seen as the ideal, but for some people it's good. I think you still got to find a way to bring those people into the social fold of what the church is about. You know, like we can't forget the horizontal dimension of meeting in space with each other. And, you know, the online thing doesn't generate those same benefits. So how do you balance those scales, right? With like wanting to be inclusive to people who can't physically come or maybe are traveling, but also encouraging the people who can be there in person to be there in person as much as they possibly can, without turning off the other people. I think that's a very delicate balance to strike. What I've been telling pastors is just think about this idea. There's this idea called friction in the economics literature. Just make something a little bit harder or a little bit easier and people will make different decisions. What if the stream wasn't automatically posted on social media? You had to email someone to get a code or a link to get that stream. If I'm just not going because I'm lazy, I'm going to have, you know, some guilt about that and I won't be emailing someone. But if I'm traveling or I'm sick, then I have no problem emailing and asking for the code or the link to get to that streaming service. So I think you got to think about ways to balance that out, you know, where you meet everyone where they're at without turning anyone off. But also I think you've got to understand that, you know, you're not going to be able to compete. The average church is not going to be able to compete with Elevation or Saddleback or, you know, Life Church that's spending literally millions of dollars on their online component. A lot of people are flocking to that because it's so slick. You know, what is your niche if it's not slick? You got to find something else. And I don't think a lot of smaller churches really have enough manpower and money to kind of find a niche that makes, you know, any sense to them.
For about 10 years, Ryan, we have been quite vocal about our belief that live streaming is tremendously overvalued in the church space relative to its outcomes and what it contributes to local churches and the spiritual growth of the parishioners. And so this is really good data to support our claims. One of the pushbacks that we've got over the years many times has been like, well, what about those that travel? What about those who are bedridden? And what I've always said is like, look, just have a private stream. Set up a real cheap camcorder. Put it in the back of the sanctuary, make that available to those that are part of the congregation that are not, but that doesn't need to be like the big front and center thing that you're trying to attract people to your church or introduce your church for the very first time. It's probably not making the best first impression anyway. Take those same resources, invest them into your website, invest them into your social ministry, invest them into one of our favorite things has always been creating a church welcome video that you can post for 3 to 12 months, 12 to 18 months, like however long you'd be. Hey, this is what it's like to attend our church for the very first time. Here's where you park. Here's where you enter through the doors. If you have kids, here's where you take them. Here's what to expect on a Sunday. Here's what a lot of people wear. Here's what, how long service programming goes. Here's where to get connected and volunteer. And now that's a great way of using online to introduce people to in-person, which we know in-person is what makes church special anyway. So it sounds like, put it on the marquee, online church, ineffective, nobody wants it, and even the people that do use it don't really like it.
Yeah. That's really the takeaway. Honestly, goodness, those are pretty good takeaways. No one, it's sort of like better than nothing, but no one really likes it. But I do like the idea of a church video. Like when I'm going to go to a new restaurant, first thing I do is Google the menu and figure out, like I'm going to give a talk in upstate New York later this week in the Chautauqua Institution. And like, they were like, well, the dress code is business. And I'm like, wait, is it really business? So I started watching videos from Chautauqua to see what people were wearing in the crowd and then what the speakers are wearing to know what I should wear too. So if you made a video, people were like, oh, this is what people are wearing. I don't want to stand out. This is what to expect when I get there. Like a 90-second video would be incredibly helpful, I think, to lower that barrier of uncertainty they have in their minds and go, okay, at least I know some of what I'm getting myself into. That might be enough for some people to go, well, I was online and now I'll come in person because I know more about the sanctuary and the space and what to expect.
A really lo-fi version of this I saw on a church's website this past week. Their call to action button at the top of their website in the hero section on the homepage was greetings from Pastor Ross. And you clicked this, YouTube video lightbox opens up, and it's just Pastor Ross sitting at a table recorded on what was clearly not like the highest, amazing setup. And it's just him talking to the camera. Hey, I'm the pastor of this church. Here's what to expect. Like, even that is superior at making a good first impression, at introducing people to your church than a live stream in most cases, I would say. Okay, let's hard pivot to a very different subject matter. And this is the article's title, Does Going to Church Keep Youth from Drinking and Smoking? I changed
Certainly
the word.
not going to online church. That's not going to keep them from anything.
Online church won't.
Yeah, no, don't even do
doesn't
that.
affect anything.
Yeah.
Here's one of the parts of the opening paragraph that you said. When I got into youth group, is quote from you. When I got into youth group, my involvement with church accelerated significantly. It seemed like I was there every day, end quote. The reason I wrote that down is because I had a virtually identical experience with church. And I feel like the church that I got into was very formative in the decisions that I made about things that were like this in high school. Am I the exception to the rule? What does the data say?
So I will say this. What's really, really striking to most people who don't pay attention to youth data very much is, man, kids back in the 70s partied a lot. Like 92% of high school seniors had consumed alcohol in 1976, and 76% of them smoked cigarettes. Like everyone was partying in the 70s, man.
Maybe that's why our parents were so adamant that we didn't do it, because they all
we've
did.
been there, done that. Yeah.
Yeah. I think we forget. Like we kind of like look back with this like rosy picture of American history that kids used to be all polite and leave it to Beaver style back in the day. Now, kids were raging back in the day, man. They were partying like crazy. And what's happened, which I think is really fascinating, is that both those numbers have declined precipitously over the last 45 years or so. So 92% of high school seniors drank alcohol in 1976. Today, it's 53%. So basically a coin flip. It used to be almost everyone, and now it's 50-50. So that's, in and of itself, is amazing if you sit back and think about what that means, like just sociologically. Smoking is even larger than that. 76% of high school seniors smoked cigarettes in 1976. Today, it's 17%. 17%. So now to find a kid who smokes and drinks is like finding a unicorn when it was like just like to everybody sitting next to you in 1976 was smoking and drinking. And now hardly anyone smokes and drinks. Like this is Jean Twenge wrote a book called Generations, which I recommend, by the way. It's a lot of this data that I'm using here she uses in her book. And she makes this bigger argument that like Gen Z is like the safest generation in American history. Like they do not party like any prior generation partied. And I don't talk about this in the article. I'm going to write something else about this at some point. They're getting their driver's licenses later than ever before. They're getting full-time or part-time jobs later than ever before. They're having sex later than ever before. They're doing drugs later than ever before. They're smoking later than ever before. They're drinking. In every possible way, this generation is doing a lot less of the quote-unquote bad stuff. They're just not, they're not raging like younger generations did. And I think, you know, we have to have a conversation as a church and as a society why that is. And if that's, this is going to sound weird to be on a Christian podcast, is that necessarily a good thing? You know, like these people, these kids growing up a lot slower. I feel like Mark Driscoll here for a second. Grow up, young men, and become blah, blah, blah. But you know what I mean? Like you got to think like at some point, like the Amish understand Rumspringa. Right? Which is like you grow up for a long time in that community. Then they give you a window of time to go out and just do whatever the heck you want for a year. And if you want to come back, great. And if you don't want to come, but what if you never have a Rumspringa? What if you never go sow your wild oats? What does that do for you long-term, psychologically, religiously, sociologically? We're not entirely sure because we've never seen a generation like the one we have right now.
Okay, so my mother was born in 1964. My father, 1963. When I was in fourth grade, I had my first science fair project. And my mother said, "We're going to get you to smoke some cigarettes, son," in the fourth grade. And she's like, "Because you're not going to be a smoker, because it's awful, and you're about to learn." So I smoked a cigarette, fourth grade. She made me finish the whole thing. We went to the local convenience store. She made sure to pick out a pack that she said was especially
probably some
disgusting
menthols or something.
Yeah, she's like, "Oh, we don't even use filters in the 70s. You're gonna like this." So I smoked the whole thing. I'm weeping. No, like literal. This is not. I'm crying. I drink an entire gallon of lemonade and never smoked again. Basically,
right.
She set me straight, and surely that was informed by her experience in the 70s. Right. So she is a teenager right when, like, if you're not smoking, that's very, very, very strange. Of course, I'm in high school, and the idea of smoking, irrespective of my church involvement, was kind of like, oh, you're like, there was the Smokers Hill in our high school that was kind of like,
we called it the smoke pit.
Right.
School,
Now, were you near the smoke pit, Alex?
Well, listen to me. I didn't have a youth pastor who stood in the gap and said, "Hey, you need to smoke this cigarette from tip to butt, and then you'll never smoke again."
Right, because you were your dad is a pastor, so you were surely set right.
Listen, I did not have the same experience as you, and I was counted amongst the, how many did you say, Ryan, seniors were smoking in high school?
Coin flip these days.
I was amongst those. But okay, so tell us, Ryan, what role does the church play? How responsible is the church for the decline in these raging and raving?
Clearly, we had revival, and now because of the church, this happened. Yes,
that's actually the really, like, I don't know, depressing part. If you're a youth pastor, is like almost nothing. Religion has almost nothing to do with the decline. Because if you tracked, so they only ask a couple of questions about religion in this survey. One's attendance and one's how important is religion to you. And if you look on either metric, man, like so young people who attended weekly are slightly less likely to drink and smoke than everyone else, but it's like 7 points less likely. And what's funny is like all the lines move in concert with each other. It's just the weekly line's like 5-7 points lower than the other lines. So everyone was declining at the same time. It's just the weekly number is just slightly lower than everybody else. So I just don't think you can look at those numbers and go, "Yep, it's definitely the church going thing." The other thing is like church going amongst young people is just absolutely falling off the table, right? So as religion has gone down among young people, smoking and drinking has also gone down among young people. So it's almost like it can't be religion. There's no way you can look at this data and go, it's because religion is keeping the kids away from the smoking and the drinking. It's something that's going on in the larger society which I think is worth some conversation about what changed amongst Gen Z that was not true amongst millennials, amongst Gen X. Like, how do we raise our kids differently than when we were raised and make them so darn scared to try anything, to go do these kind of risky behaviors? I think we all look back and go, man, I was dumb when I was a kid, but man, that was fun. And I wonder
Right.
what are kids, like the kids who are 16 now, in 15 years, when they're in their 30s, going to look back when they're teenagers and go, gosh, I didn't do anything fun. Like I wasn't doing all the dumb stuff that my parents and grandparents did. And I really missed out on, they're going to get like a YOLO moment, like a nostalgic YOLO for like, I did not do those dumb things. And they might turn out fine. I don't know. But again, we're running this experiment on people in real time, and they're going to be adults someday, and they're going to, how are they going to raise their kids? Is the pendulum going to swing the other way? Like, oh, here's some, like drink. Okay. Smoke. Okay. Like, I just don't know how this ends, because we've never seen this quick of a change in behavior amongst young people. So we don't know what the other side of this looks like yet.
So this all really interests me, like the downside of so much like abstinence from all of these things. When I got involved with church in high school, I was extremely devoted. Famously, did not go to prom because I was serving at junior youth.
Wow.
As an example. And my wife, who did go to prom with another man, was like, you're really dumb.
Yeah,
you know that?
should've
And my
been
mom was like, what are you doing? Go to prom. And I was like, Mom, these kids are like in grade 6, 7, 8. They need a mentor. Me. We're going to an amusement park. Like, I can't miss that. My mom urged me. Once, like, my mom loved, to be clear, my mom loved Jesus, an extremely amazing woman, my spiritual mentor. Not always, though, because in high school, she would urge me. She's like, just kiss a girl, son. And I was like, Mom, like, I dated my wife for an entire year before we kissed. And that was like the only woman I kissed ever, except for a secret relationship I had with a girl from youth group, where I would bike 2 towns over, like 20 miles I'd bike to see this girl. And I took her to a Christian music festival, and I asked my mom as an adult, because we didn't work out, and I asked my mom, I was like, you knew we weren't just friends. Like, I was kissing her. She's like, yeah, I know, you dummy. You weren't like, of course we knew. Yeah. We thought that was good. Yeah. Like, you both love Jesus. You're figuring out, you're a teenager. Like, that's fascinating, because I always like thought, oh, this is bad.
So your mom, well, you mentioned your mom was born in the 60s, grew up in the 70s. So she was one of these raging
she raged.
Kids, and she saw you missing out, and she knew as a teenager, that's a safe time to try that stuff. You're going to grow up and grow out of it. She just wanted you to have the same experience. But you're part of this stat group of downward trends of kids not smoking or drinking.
Right. She was doing illicit drugs, and I was like, oh, I kissed a girl. Like, she's like, yeah, it's fine. You're gonna be fine.
But I think that's like the bigger question, though, is like, we want our kids to experience life, right? Like most things in life, you want them to experience you don't want to get like hooked on heroin, obviously, but like, how much value is there in your kid maybe drinking a little bit of beer when they graduate high school? You know what I mean? Or smoking a little pot here. Like, what is, from a youth, I'm not a youth pastor anymore, I used to be. It was like abolitionists back in the day, right? Like you wanted to make sure the kids stayed far, far away from all that stuff. But I think you also don't want them to get older and go, gosh, I lived such a buttoned up youth that I missed all these. I think a lot of times when people have that really bad midlife crisis, it's because they did not blow it out when they were kids, and you got to sow your wild oats at some point. I think the average person is not cool living a buttoned up life 100%. Everyone has a vice. That's what as I've gotten older, I've realized everyone has a vice. It's just teaching us how to, be controlled with those vices to not cause damage to ourselves or people around us is the most important thing. I think the whole I kiss dating goodbye thing was so ruinous because it said, no, you got to live completely buttoned up in this pure life, knowing that 98% of us are not wired to do that. And we're going to feel guilty and shame and terrible people because we maybe kissed a girl or held hands with a girl or dated someone before we got married, when it's like, man, what kind of standard are we holding kids to? Because all that standard did for me personally was lead to a lot of personal shame and guilt. That's what it led to. I've been married to my wife now for almost 17 years. We have a great relationship. I kissed other girls before I married her. Do I regret that? Absolutely not. You know what I mean? So I think the problem is that you're heaping, what is too much? What is too high of a standard to call people to? Because you want them to be better, but you also don't want them to feel miserable all the time because they fall short of this almost impossible standard you set for them. So I just don't know what the youth ministry conversation looks like right now, but I think that should be a really important part of that conversation is how much do we expect of our kids and how much is too much?
Yeah, we're living through this in real time. I'm not a youth pastor, but I am a pastor, and so I empathize with the folks who are leading like the youth in our church, and we're going through this in real time in the sense that like when me and Brady were in high school, marijuana was very illegal here, and now for our high school students, marijuana is very legal here, and so coming up to I think it's 19 or whatever, same age as drinking, like you can legally go and acquire marijuana, and so this is a conversation that we didn't have to have as teenagers, like and as Christian teenagers, is it holy? Is it appropriate to use this substance legally in the way that it is to like maybe have one beer, have a glass of wine? So that's a brand new conversation that like we're having in real time right now. And you know, Brady and I, we have young kids. We haven't kind of crossed that bridge yet with legal drug use with our kids, but like surely that'll be a conversation. And that's, you know, I just kind of breezed over it quickly, but that is the guiding question for like how me and my wife parent and how I live my own personal life is just asking myself that question all the time is this holy? Can I have this glass of wine in a holy way? And so for me, my personal conviction is yes. For others, it's no. And that's like, there's no right or wrong there. But we're asking brand new questions now that we didn't have to ask or answer 10 or 15 years ago, at least in this province. So yeah, really interesting times that we're living through, and we can see that reflected in the data. And Ryan, I'm really looking forward to your next article that's surely going to be titled, "Does Going to Church Keep You from Having Premarital Sex?"
Oh, yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Listen, guys. Listen.
Surely that, yes?
No. The article on Thursday, that's actually going to run in 2 days from now when we're recording this, is about marijuana usage among high school seniors. Because so many people asked me about it. And it took me forever to get the data right because the data's a mess. But it looks like the share of high school seniors who don't drink, don't smoke, but have used marijuana in the last 30 days is gone from about 1% to about 4% over the last 45 years. So it's not nothing. But I will say, I'll give you, here's a little preview. You know what the percentage of kids who are straight edge are? You know, so straight edge is like not drink, not smoke, cigarettes or marijuana. So the three things. In the 1970s, it was about 10% of high school seniors were straight edge based on that definition. Today, it's almost 40% of high school seniors have not drank, smoked, or done drugs in the prior 30 days. Highest it's been in the last 45 years. So again, the safest generation in American history without a shadow of a doubt, at least in the modern era, in terms of not engaging in those three things.
Okay, so workshopping some headlines here for the marijuana one. Like, marijuana use up 400% amongst youth.
Right.
Right?
That's the scare one.
Oh,
very good, yes.
The relative change, not so much. But this is an interesting one. And I'm fascinated. I picked these three articles from Ryan because I'm fascinated by data that goes against kind of like what is expected. In the previous one about online church, I can't tell you how many times I've been at a conference, been on a podcast, and the conversation has been like, you know what? We need to stop all this online church stuff. Like, in person is what matters. And everyone's like, yeah, as if like it's this rallying cry against the norm, when in reality, like everyone agrees. Like no one is disagreeing with you. We're all on board. And the same is kind of true here. The common thing is social media ruins teens' lives, anxiety, loneliness. Like, I'm not here to dispute any of that. But then what would equally be a true headline, and here's like, you know, correlation to causation, like social media creates safest generation in 50 years. Drinking stopped, smoking stopped, drug use gone. Thank you, Facebook. Like that's just as true, right? Like,
well, I wrote a post called "People Aren't Having Sex Anymore." It's the most popular post ever. If you look at the data, people are having sex, and by the way, married people are having sex less today than they had it in the late 1980s. Like, social media has basically given us something to entertain ourselves so we don't do anything else. We don't have sex, we don't drink, we don't smoke, we don't do drugs. So I guess in some ways you can say, well, that's a good thing. Like, I really do think, like, we're seeing by the way the pendulum swing on social media, you're seeing a lot of school districts now in the States banning cell phone use in schools, which I think we're all coming to the realization of, like, are those things good? The kids aren't smoking and drinking? Probably on balance, yes. But there's a lot of downside risk that's like objectively bad. anxiety, loneliness, depression, all those things are way, way bad. And would we take drinking and smoking coming back a little bit to get rid of a lot of the anxiety and isolation? I think I would personally. Like, if the kids got together once a month and, drank a few beers, but at least hung out with each other, that's not a bad outcome in my world, as long as they do it responsibly, obviously. Because right now that's not happening. They're just hanging on their phones and they're living the whole world on Snapchat, and it's killing them psychologically. So I think we're going to see, what's fascinating is we're running an experiment right here in real time, in the general population, and we're going to see how it shakes out with young people. And hopefully, what we see is we kind of find an equilibrium, right? Where we turn down the anxiety, depression enough, and we turn up the drinking, smoking up a little bit, and the sex stuff a little bit, where we can live with both and go, okay, this balance is a much better future for young people than what we have right now.
Well, and you mentioned in one of these 3 articles, I forget which one, you mentioned Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation.
Yep.
And we don't need to delve too far into it right now, but you're painting a picture of a new vice, a new means of entertainment that has really overtaken some of the more popular vices: sex, drinking, drugs, smoking. And so, yeah, maybe youth pastors aren't up against like trying to disciple their youth on like what their relationship with alcohol is according to the data, but we surely are up against discipling our youth with how to engage with these devices. That is the thing that, like you've said a few times here, Ryan, that is the experiment that is unfolding in real time. Mm-hmm. And the data supports that as well. So, I'm so grateful to because Brady and I our minds kind of just operate the same way when it comes to, just how we approach things in life and rooting it in like empirical data. So like being able to wrestle with these real conversations about online church and drinking and whatever, but to be able to anchor them in data to give us insight into how we make decisions and what we're going to talk about next. Just really grateful for that. But we got one more, don't we?
Well, if I could just say one more thing,
Yes.
we at the beginning of each show in the intro, biggest communication shift in 500 years, and we think about that in reference to how we're going to take our Christian worldview and share it with the world. But what's also true is that like we are part of this experiment, and I saw a skit today on social, and it was like, AI solves cancer. And I said to my wife, I was eating lunch, and I said, I wonder if that might not be true for us, but like, I hope it's true for like the kids. Like, I feel like there's so much that we don't know right now about the human body, and like, because we're all part of this experiment, and now we've added devices to it, and how much that's going to change everything. And so I always like what you say, like, how can we make the best next holy choice in front of us? And it sounds like, yes, our generation is not going to have lung cancer, and our cardiovascular disease rates might go down, but we're just going to have no fun, and we'll be miserable, and we'll have to live longer because of it.
Yeah.
So
terrible.
Score, I guess.
That might be the outcome. We live to 110, but we hate every minute of it. Like, that's...
Yeah, we're all going to... In our old age, we're going to pick up drinking and smoking then.
You know what? I've had enough. Pass the blunt.
Yes.
Blow it out. I'm 85. It ain't getting better from here. Let's roll. Come on.
Oh, my gosh. Okay, let's put this behind us, thank God, and go on to the third article. Final one here. Are women more spiritual and men more religious is the title. Graphs about religion. We're all very familiar with that I'm spiritual, not religious remark. I think we all can understand as we deal with data relative to faith, is that faith by nature is not easy to quantify. And what you say at the beginning of this article is that, hey, there was this new survey by Fetzer Institute that asked questions about faith differently, and that yielded some interesting responses. So what was different about the survey that inspired this article?
Well, I'll tell you this really cool part of the survey is they asked people to draw a picture of spirituality. I've never seen that on us. Like, literally draw a picture, and you can I was at a conference and they showed me a bunch of these pictures, and I was like, what is the world? It all looked very basic, like crayons and stuff like that. But you know what the most common image was for spirituality? Was a mountain. I think that's really interesting in a whole bunch. I think I'm still thinking about what that means. Like, because obviously in Christianity, mountains are incredibly important in the Old and New Testament. But like for non-religious people, why are mountains still seen as spiritual? I don't have a great answer for that. Maybe it's still that religious imprinting, like that residue is still hanging around. But It's also probably easier to draw a mountain than draw like a force or a spirit or whatever. So anyway, the Fetzer.
What can I draw?
Yeah.
is a
Yeah,
big
what
part of
can
that
I draw?
exercise,
Not
yeah.
what would I like to draw. Well, can an AI draw it for me? That would be fantastic.
I can draw that 3DS from the late 90s, early
Yes,
2000s. but that-
absolutely.
When you were rolling your blunts, you drew the 3DS. That's what you did on your paper at the same time.
Yeah, there it is. We're getting an insight. You know who couldn't draw that S? Me. I cannot draw that S. I'll tell you that much.
Well, so what's cool about this study is like Fetzer is really interested in like new age spirituality stuff to try to like figure out how religion and spirituality are evolving. So it asks all kinds of like off the beaten path questions about spirituality that you would not see like in a mainstream survey, because they're really just focused on this like niche of a niche. And what I really wanted, someone in my comments one time was like, don't you think that women are more spiritual and men are more religious? Because women are like all into crystals and tarot cards and horoscopes and astrology and all that stuff. And I was like, yeah, that kind of seems... like it seems like you're probably right. Let's figure out if you're right or not. So this Fetzer data is actually really cool because it gets into all that niche-y stuff about spirituality. One thing I want to point out is women are way more likely to believe in God without any doubts compared to men. 55% of women say they believe in God without any doubts. It's only 43% of men. Like, that's a big gap there. Men are significantly more likely. They're twice as likely to say they don't believe in God, 9% versus 4%. And they're 5 points more likely to say they believe in some higher power, 15% versus 10%. But if you look at belief measures, like men score way lower in their belief in a higher power or God compared to women do, which I think is really interesting. Because women, we talk about spirituality tends to be more amorphous. Like, it's not like, I don't believe in God, I believe in the spirit or the divine or the higher power or whatever. But in this question, at least, it pretty clearly looks like women have a much more certain belief in God than men do.
I'm just like, I've been ruminating on this ever since I read the article, because like, without getting into, at the risk of becoming too binary and like traditional gender roles or whatever, like I was reflecting on this, wondering like, what can we conclude from this? And I was reminded of the Gospels and how repeatedly in the Gospel stories, when the men had this habit of like fleeing, so whether it was Peter or Judas or whoever else, they just kind of scattered when things got tough. The women always just happened to stick around, whether it was at the foot of the cross or in the garden. They were entrusted with the first word of the resurrection. And so like, there certainly is something to that. And what struck me in this article and the many graphs in this article is that like, it's conclusive, like almost, if not among every point of data, it was like conclusive. Women are just more spiritual than men across like just about every point.
How about this? To what extent do you feel connected to a higher power? 40% of women said highly connected. It was only 26% of men said highly connected. Meanwhile, 23% of men said they're not at all connected to a higher power, compared to only 12% of women. So men were twice as likely to say they're not at all connected to a higher power compared to women. And then women are significantly more likely to say they're very connected. So like, you look at those two pieces of data together and go, good gravy, man. Like, what's going on with men here? They have a much more higher doubt, right? And then they also don't even feel connected. It's like they're sort of like closed off spiritually in some ways that I don't really like. When I think about gender and religion, I always think of Mark Driscoll. I don't know why, because I probably grew up in the 1990s and the dude was talking about like men grow up the whole time and how they were the ones who were being like spiritually impotent, right? Who are not like really connecting to the church and all those things. And like, whatever Mark Driscoll saw in the 1990s is definitely evident in the data, 15 years down the line, because it feels like men are like that. Religion, I feel like when I look at this data, the sense I get is what men say that religion's women's stuff. Like, that's a woman's area of life, and I'm not going to deeply connect to that, either spiritually or religiously, by the way. Like, the conceit of the whole piece was, like, women are more spiritual and men are more religious, but amongst women, 11% of them say they're very spiritual and very religious. It's only 6% of men say they're very spiritual and very religious. Men 17% said they're not at all spiritual or religious. Amongst women, it's only 7%. So like you can't, it's almost impossible to look at this data and think that men are more religious. They're not. They're actually less religious, and they're less spiritual than women are. They're just really, this is an arena where women dominate, women rule, women have all the confidence and all the belief and all the connection, and men are just sort of like sitting on the sidelines and drifting away.
Well, and I'm just going to go ahead and put my pastor hat on and say that like what this says to me is that we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot to learn from women, first and foremost, on their vulnerability, their sense of emotion, their ability to trust and have faith, their capacity to love and be loved, to take care and be taken care of. We have a lot to learn from women, and we have a lot of work to do in the arena of how we talk to men and amongst men about the things of faith, because the data seems to suggest that the way we've been talking to men about faith in the language of, I don't know, guns and barbecues, like that is not exactly working. When women are doing women's conference talking about gardens and flowers and the earth, and I don't know, just from the way I interpret the gospel of Jesus and the entire story of the gospel, it starts in a garden and ends in a garden. So the women really seem to be onto something here. And that's being reflected in the data. Like they are much more in relationship with a divine higher power than men are. And that's a yellow flag, if not a red one, for church leaders and how we converse about faith amongst gendered people.
So what's so interesting is like the caricature version of talking about faith with men is, guns and brisket. But Ryan brought up Driscoll. And I remember before all of the bad that happened with Mars Hill and Driscoll, I was a 19-year-old in my gap year between high school and Bible college. Mm-hmm. And I listened to Mark Driscoll 8 hours a day because I was working construction. So I just want you to like imagine like this was just like about as man as it can get.
Yeah.
So all day I'm hauling lumber and like just sweating with my shirt off and like I have a perfect tan, and all I'm doing is listening to Mark Driscoll preach for 90 minutes at a time per sermon. And every sermon is extremely studious. It's like really dense. And he keeps calling men to be better. Mm-hmm. And that resonated with me. Like, sure. I'm a young man and he's like, be better. And I'm like, okay, I love that. Thank you. Like, that's what I need to hear right now. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, it perhaps went a bit too far into some really toxic territory. But like, Mark Driscoll and everyone that was a part of Mars Hill who now looks back is like, why were we there? The ones that like remember why is because they were like, I was being called into something in the world of faith that I had never really experienced in church before, and it resonated with me, and it was men for the most part. It resonated with me in ways that I had never really resonated with faith before. Is there something there that we can pull that's positive?
Yeah.
I just think that Driscoll is you know what the evolution of Driscoll is? It's Joe Rogan. Like, I think like whatever Driscoll and Jordan Peterson, like whatever that guy did has been like, there's a need in the blogosphere, ecosphere, podcastosphere for that kind of like men yelling at other men, telling them to be better thing. And I think when Driscoll went away, that whole sentiment didn't go away. It just sort of evolved into a non-religious space. And actually, I think in some ways a worse space. Like the Rogan phenomenon is like a weird... That dude is the most listened to podcast in America, guys. Like, you cannot tell me there's not a need for men to hear men having conversations at that level. It might be a little offensive and might be a little tangential and might be a little weird at times and offensive at times. Men want to have those kind of conversations. It's just the church kind of sucks at having those kind of conversations. I don't even think it's, by the way, from the pulpit is probably not the most appropriate way to have those conversations either. Like, I think you need to have it... Some of it for sure, but I think it needs to happen in the hallways and in the Sunday school classes and in, the parking lot on the way out, having conversations with men, especially men who are like in their 30s and 40s who are raising kids who don't really get to talk to other men about raising kids who have the same worldview that they do and the same values that they do. I think that's the value that, to call back to the virtual church thing, you don't get that with virtual church, by the way. You know what I mean? Men are not, you're not hanging out in the breakout rooms with other men on Zoom. during online church. And that's what men need to do more often than not, is just sit in the parking lot with their buddy on the way out and talk for 20 minutes before you get in your car and drive away. Just have a touch base about what it means to be a man in 2024 with changing gender roles and consent and raising kids and what toxic masculinity is versus positive masculinity. I just don't know where we're getting those messages in. That's not Joe Rogan, which is not always a positive message, I don't think.
You know, we kind of made fun of the caricature like guns and barbecue, but just to pull back the curtain fully here, on Saturday, myself and Alex, along with 2 of our buddies that also work here at the company, so 4 husbands, 4 fathers, we all got together for some bro time. We went into Toronto, we went to the city, and we had a great meal together. And
smoked meat.
Spoiler alert, it was all meat. It was it was called the Big ASS Board was the name on the actual. So we're like, yeah, we'll get that.
Yeah.
They bring on a giant bunch of meat on a wooden thing, and I had a beer.
Yeah.
I had a light beer. And then we went to see WWE Money in the Bank and watched men fall through tables from ladders. And so maybe we are the caricatures.
Yes.
You know,
True.
we pretend to think of ourselves as, well, we're elevated. You know, in Canada, we don't really have guns. So that's you know, no, instead we watch men go through tables in their trunks. So that's what happened to us. My final question here, Ryan, is like, is there any insight here on what's the chicken and the egg? Because what we've heard from men for many years in church is like, I go to church and it's like, it's a really feminine experience at church. But then this data would suggest that, well, in terms of like supply and demand, the people that want church aren't the men. So then you would think over time, church starts to become a bit more serving the people that actually want to go to church. And then the men come and they go, well, this isn't for me. It's like, well, yeah, of course it's not for you. You never wanted to be here in the first place. Like, what do we do about that?
You know, the saddest graph of the whole one's like this one about spiritual activities. Like in the last week, have you done any of the following stuff? And it's like a whole big old list of like meditation and going in nature and reading and prayer. You know what? There's not a single activity on the list where men do it more often than women do. Like not a single one. Men, here's what I feel like. Men don't do things like at all. Like they don't have hobbies. They don't have a way to let steam off. And I think that's kind of might be the bigger issue. I mean, I don't know about you, but I work and then I work. And I don't like I was at a conference, guy goes, well, so what's your hobbies? I go, I don't know. I make graphs. He goes, that's your job. I go, yeah, but it's also my hobby too, buddy. He's like, you gotta have difference. You know, you gotta have a difference, right? Like the things you do for money, you know, and the things you do for work are different than the things you do for fun. And I'm like, I do? Like no one had that conversation with me, if that makes any sense. Like I didn't have a guy in my life to really be like, hey, I'm old, I'm experienced. Let me tell you what I learned the hard way when I was 40 years old. You know, and you need to figure this out before because I had a crisis to figure it out for me. I need you to head off before you get to that area. That's the kind of conversations that churches facilitate. And by the way, again, it's not always pastoral led. It could be just a wise old guy in the church. Like there's such a value in wise old guys who are 70 years old, who are humble, honest, good human beings who want to see the next generation not fall in the same traps that they fell into. I'll give you a story real quick. I've buried a lot of people as a pastor. My church is old. I've done a lot of funerals. I sit by bedsides for people in the last weeks or two of their lives, and they're very honest with me because, well, they got to lose, right? And you know what I consistently hear over and over again was these older guys especially grew up, we're in the 50s and 60s, we're working like crazy. They go, I wish I would have spent more time with my wife and my kids. You know, not a single one of them has ever told me I wish I would have spent more time working. Not a single one of them. And to me, it's like if I hear that over and over again and I don't respond to that, I'm an idiot because they're giving me like the eternal wisdom. And you know what's sad about that? They wouldn't have given that to me 5 years ago when they weren't on their deathbed. They'll only tell me their regrets at the very, very end of their life. I think we need to create a culture where men are more willing to say, like, speak from their heart when they're not near the end. You know, when they actually have more things to tell you and can tell you more things and help you get along the way. So I don't know if you want to create like a formal mentorship program, but man, an informal network of like the wise counsel of old dudes is not a bad idea in a lot of churches to help these guys. You know, maybe it's like, oh, we heard so-and-so is going through it. Maybe might get divorced. Have him go talk to the council of wise old dudes and just talk it through, and maybe he still ends up getting divorced, but at least he had the conversation. Like I think that kind of conversation, where do we have space for that in American society, in Canadian society anymore? The answer is not very many places. And I think church used to be a space like that, and it's not anymore. And I think men are really struggling because of that.
When there are more men listening to this podcast than women, and most of those men are roughly the ages of the 3 people on this podcast. And so what that means is we're talking about something that every one of us is living through right now. And so if there are any clear takeaways from this, aside from entertainment and educational value, it's, check on your friends and find things to put your passion into, and take all that just great masculine energy and put it into something that isn't work and isn't family and isn't something that you have to do. Something that's recreational, because that can be incredibly healthy, and be the leaders in the church that we want to see more of, right? Slacking, there aren't as many. The women are doing their part, let's do our part as well.
That's right.
Ryan, Graphs About Religion is where we can find you. Anywhere else that we should be checking up? I know you are in so many different spaces.
Yeah, Graphs About Religion is really the become the center spoke. I'm on Twitter at Ryan Burge. You want to follow me there. If you want to, you can find my website, drburge.com, drburge.com. RyanBurge.net gets you to the same spot. You can find all my work there, my academic work, books I've written. You want to do a speaking request, you can do it there. My calendar's booking up, though, so it'd probably be next year if you want me to come out and yell at you guys about graphs. But please let me do graphs, because I'm doing this thing in upstate New York, and they don't have, it's outside, and there's no projector. And I'm like, how do you want me to talk about this for 45 minutes without graphs? They're like, you'll figure it out. I'm like, but will I, though?
You're going to be printing a lot of graphs.
Imagine a graph.
5 of your...
of your pamphlet, turn to page 7 and look at the green line.
That's right, yeah.
All right, great stuff, Ryan. Thanks again for coming on, and thank you for your time, attention, and trust. We will talk to you next Wednesday.
We're joined again by Ryan Burge from Graphs About Religion. We're joined again by Ryan Burge from Graphs About Religion.